on time, but we do beg your indulgence as we await some more participants to come in the room. So we would begin at 9:15. Okay? Thanks.
Let me see if you've done anything yet.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being so patient with us as we're about to start, and we can have a prompt 9:15 start. Let me do the housekeeping. Again, my name is Francola John from the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. And just for our online participants and those who may be joining for the first time online, to interact with our speakers today, kindly use the chat for questions during the moderated question and answer sessions. For our remote speakers, to reduce disruption during the workshop, you will be allowed to start your video shortly before your speaking slot. If you have not completed your evaluation form from day one, we kindly ask that you do so via the link on our website at ctu.int. Click on the event page and select the evaluation form. We appreciate your feedback for us to better serve you going forward. So for the chairperson to take over for today, I would now hand over to Vashti Maharaj to take you through today's proceedings.
Hello everyone, good morning. I trust that you'd have a wonderful evening's rest. For those of you who joined us for the cocktails, you had a lovely time, and I'd like to wish you all a happy Valentine's Day. So we have lots of wonderful things ahead, and I'm going to start off today's proceedings with our wonderful presenter. If you can put up her bio. Can you hear me? All right. Can you hear me now? Right. So this morning, we're going to start off with a presentation from Ms. Cindy Parokkil, who is the International Policy Manager at the British Standards Institution that leads its International Digitalization Program. She advises governments and international organizations on leveraging international standards and the quality infrastructure system to achieve policy objectives covering digital transformation and sustainability. I am sure that Cindy is going to have a wealth of information to impart this morning, and I'd like to kindly invite her to the podium.
All right. Thank you so much, Vashti. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you and kick off day 2. First, I'd like to say yesterday's session was fantastic. I learned so much, and I was very much on a listening mode because I feel that the challenges you have laid out yesterday has created a fertile ground for my presentation today on the role of standards to build trust in the digital economy. So, the challenges that you outlined, I feel standards are part of the solution. They're not the only solution, particularly to address issues around digital trust, smoothing regulatory differences, and bringing agility to the regulatory framework. So over the next 20 to 25 minutes, I will introduce the policy context, review the barriers to digitalization and digital trade, outline the role of international standards, complementing regulation and legislation, and finally I'll conclude with some final remarks. Okay, so all right, so I have 5 trends or issues that sort of set the policy context for us. One is that there's an increase in digital services globally, but note the difference between the markets. 2 is that the digital economy is dominated by a few platforms, raising concerns around monopoly and inequality in terms of realizing the benefits of the digital economy between regions. 3, the developing world is being left behind. This was a challenge raised yesterday, the growing digital divide. And as the World Economic Forum notes, one of the key challenges that we will be grappling with over the next 10 years is the issue of cybercrime and dealing with the fear of cyber inequality. So the global cost of attacks on cybersecurity has been $6 trillion in 2021, expected to increase by 15% per annum to reach $10.5 trillion. And what does this do? It raises issues around global mistrust, discourages investment in countries with weak cybersecurity. And that brings me to my final contextual slide here, which is ITU's Global Cybersecurity Index. And the clear point here is that there is a need to bolster the cybersecurity of this region, to build trust, and to encourage investment and facilitate trade. So, going back to the World Economic Forum, as it notes, digital trust is the currency that facilitates future innovation. What is digital trust? It's being sure that your systems are secure, your digital ID and provenance is not breached, and cloud and interoperability is enabled. So, to improve digital trust, we need intentional and persistent trust-building initiatives. And that is exactly what the international standards infrastructure offers. So obviously, trust starts with regulation and legislation, but as you can see from this diagram, it varies tremendously across the world. 30% of countries do not have legislation in place to enable data protection. And to implement regulation and legislation, we need sound regulatory institutions. And as you can see, once again, there is a huge difference in terms of institutions in place to enable data protection and deal with cybersecurity issues. And there are fundamental different approaches to regulation. The approach taken by the EU is different to that of the US, China, for various reasons, including, cultural differences and economic models. So the upshot of all of this is a rise in national and regional regulations, creating a fragmented regulatory policy framework. And this causes trade restrictions. So what do we need? As UNCTAD beautifully notes, we need a middle ground, a global data governance framework that creates neutral solutions, minimizing the risk. And this is what the international standard system once again offers. So I keep referring to the system, and it is a national, European, national, regional, and international system that exists. It is ready to be utilized. There are institutions in place that can really support and work with government representatives to build trust in this digital space. So at the international level, we have ISO, IEC, and ITU, and various US standards development organizations. Then at the regional level, taking Europe in consideration, we have CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. And if we are to look at the Americas, we have COPANT, and to specifically focus on the Caribbean, we have a sub-regional standards body called CrossQ. And my colleague, Fulgence, is here from CrossQ. So if you have not spoken to him, please do. And CrossQ comprises of 15 national standards bodies from the region. So just talking about this system here, BSI is the British Standards Institution. We are a member of ISO, IEC, and CEN and CENELEC. And I'll outline to you what national standards bodies do, but in the context of the UK's national standards body. So we were the first national standards body to be created, and we are the founding member of ISO. What we essentially do is represent the UK's interests at European and international standard setting organizations. And our primary role is to support the development of trusted market frameworks in our economy through better industry practices, better regulation, and consumer protection. And how do we do this? By creating standards and encouraging their use to help improve the quality and safety of products, services, and systems. So the UK government and BSI agree that standardization is a key factor to support a number of government policies. I've listed a range of different areas, but essentially all parts of the economy. And standardization is able, when used in conjunction with legislation, to promote better regulation. So, what is the value of the international standard system? Firstly, standards are voluntary, market-led, and needs-driven. They are developed when there is a gap in the market. They're developed by convening the ecosystem, diverse groups of experts. What we want is a balance of views around the standards-making table. Standards, the legitimacy of standards comes through its development process. It goes through a deep consensus-building process, the governance framework in place, and a public consultation process, which has been finessed over 122 years. We undergo systematic review to ensure the continuity and validity of standards, and standards can be supported through conformity assessment and accreditation to provide additional layers of assurance and trust. And ultimately, standards enable innovation. They do not stifle innovation, as many people, falsely think. We have also developed fast-track standardization processes to keep up with the rapidly evolving digital space, if you will. So we have PASs, flexes, so there's a range of processes that we can leverage to support. And finally, standards can support regulatory policy and compliance with regulation. So in terms of trust, obviously regulation and legislation are absolutely fundamental, but on its own, it's not enough. What we need is deep engagement with the entire ecosystem. So this involves regulators, government institutions, quality infrastructure institutions, so standards bodies, accreditation bodies, metrology institute, consumers, and industry. And this is what the standard system enables. So standards can address three drawbacks of regulation and legislation. One being the political timetable regulation often does not keep pace with technology change, so it can be outdated. National barriers sometimes can create barriers to trade and market fragmentation, and standards can be referenced in regulation, and regulation rarely explains the how-to. But the good news is that standards can be referenced in regulations through numerous methods, and the benefits are that regulators can rely on the technical expertise of standards developers and save resources. They can expect broad acceptance of regulation because, people were involved in the standards development process. They can expect that it reflects the latest technologies and developments and ensure regulatory agility and smooth over regulatory differences. So as we were discussing yesterday, countries can set their own regulation, but if they reference international standards, then it smooths over those differences and can facilitate trade. So, to summarize, international standards have a crucial role to play in the digital transformation process. It is not the be-all and end-all. It fits within a framework, and for a few reasons. Standards can can help build trust in the innovative application of digital technology. National standards bodies, so all of your countries have a national standards body, and when empowered, they can be conduits of excellence. They can drive change and work hand in glove with government to realize objectives. Certification schemes and trust marks. To build standards, so trust can be underpinned by standards, but in order to further that, certification schemes, accredited certification schemes that are built on standards furthers that. And finally, standards and certification have been increasingly being used in government procurement policy as a means to mitigate risk. And an example of that is that in the UK, if companies are wishing to bid for government contracts, they are increasingly requested to comply to 27001 when they're dealing with sensitive data, etc. You'll get the slide deck, but here are a few examples where the UK government is using international standards for this reason. Okay, so I hope that I have pricked your curiosity to consider standards going forward, but now into the real implementation part of it. So in 2021, BSI did some research to understand the role of standards in supporting the digital transformation process. And we conducted some research together with CrossQ, which revealed that the uptake of international standards is very low in the Caribbean and also in Africa. And we wanted to understand a bit more why this is happening, and two clear reasons emerged. One is that there's a proliferation of standards in this space. We are not perfect either. And two, national standards bodies just do not have the capacity to engage effectively with their policymakers, and especially new ministries that they do not regularly engage with, such as the Ministry of ICT. So in order to address the first issue, BSI, together with international experts and our internal in-house expertise, we identified what are the top 5 standards to build national digital resilience, covering 4 key areas. 1 being information and cybersecurity, 2, protection of privacy, 3, digital ID and provenance, and the last one is interoperability and cloud. But standards alone are not enough. So building on that, what we need is that people and institutions have the capacity to actually make use of these standards and realize the benefits. So to that end, we developed a standards-based digitalization toolkit, and the objective is to demonstrate to government departments, national standards bodies, multilateral development banks, and the whole digital ecosystem how standards and national standards bodies can help build trust and provide confidence in the digital transformation process and facilitate digital trade. So the toolkit comprises of 2 key elements: a policy roundtable, which convenes senior stakeholders from government departments, regulators, so from a national digital economy, and make sure that they put a focus on international standards as a tool to complement regulation and legislation as an additional policy tool. And, by building this focus, the objective is to send their staff to a 4-day capacity building program on the importance of standards, where their key practitioners will understand and learn how to use standards. So I just want to highlight here that let me just go back, actually. Yeah, so we developed, I should highlight that we developed this toolkit with the advice of a high-level expert panel comprising of the UN, development banks, the Commonwealth Secretariat. Vashti, thank you so much for your time and your expertise from the legal side. National standards bodies, regional standards organization, just to make sure that this is not just the standards community, speaking to the standards community. We want to make sure that it really addresses your needs. And our work and the work of UNCTAD really highlights that standards do play an important part in the digital transformation process. I'm not sure if you're aware, but UNCTAD have an excellent policy tool called the E-Trade Readiness Assessment, which measures the readiness for countries to engage in the digital economy. And they look at 7 key policy areas. And they've incorporated standards into their policy tool. And I'll talk about the example of applying that tool in Kenya. So the results, basically they ran a survey, and the results were very clear. The public and private sector in Kenya view international standards as an important tool in promoting trust in e-commerce. So for areas such as system security, it's as high as 89%. And furthermore, the stakeholders realize that skills on standards are one of the top 5 issues for skills development in order to really further the digital economy. And based on this, in collaboration with UNCTAD, the digital ministry in ICT, Ministry of ICT in Kenya, the Trade Ministry, the UK government, and the National Standards Body in Kenya, KEBS, we ran a policy workshop with senior stakeholders from the digital economy in Kenya. So I've listed the different institutions there just so that you can see the range of people we convened to make sure that standards are considered in taking the digital economy forward. And the result of that was that the Kenyan stakeholders incorporated international standards in their national e-commerce strategy, and they recognized the need for capacity building. So with the support of the UK government and in collaboration with the National Standards Body of Kenya, we delivered a 4-day standards-based capacity building program to key practitioners from the digital institutions, and with the aim of creating a network of champions, standards champions in Kenya, so that they can support each other and really realize the benefits of standards-led growth. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is work with countries to go on this digital maturity road, regardless of where you're starting, be it basic or pioneering. And what we feel is that in order to really go down this path, national standards bodies and this, this quality infrastructure system really needs to be empowered and brought to the forefront if we want to realize that value. Yes, and with all levers of change, it is important to monitor progress, and it is the best way forward here is to incorporate dynamic indicators into digital maturity indices. For example, I've listed the World Bank's Government Tech Maturity Index, which is great. However, it mainly focuses on binary indicators, and the uptake of standards and certification sort of brings more dynamism into the maturity indices, and also the indices that the scorecard that we heard about yesterday, IDS, I didn't see standards in there, but maybe there is an opportunity to explore that potential to really bring that dynamic element to measuring progress. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, international standards are an additional and agile policy tool that can complement regulation and legislation. There's an opportunity here for us to embed standards in policies, reference them in regulations, strategies, and digital maturity indices. Standards and the quality infrastructure system play a critical role in building trust, supporting governments and industry. Standardization can further and scale up innovation and help develop emerging and nascent markets. National standards bodies, or members of ISO, are naturally the neutral convener of the national ecosystem in a country and can provide a platform for collaboration to build upon and enhance existing international good practice. And this is all good and well, but we really need more awareness raising and capacity building of the public sector and the private sector to leverage this system and use it as a business tool and a policy tool in digitizing priority sectors. It's not just digital, the digital economy on its own, but it's the trade, financial services, healthcare. These standards can support all these areas. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, very happy to take it.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I find that's a great way to start the day. It's a very innovating presentation, so don't hold yourself back. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have. I see a question on the floor.
Well, it was me. Hi, morning. Thank you for your presentation, Cindy. It was great. I just wanted to pick up on one small thing. I heard that you mentioned that in your analysis with Parokkil, with Fulgens, that you had identified a lack of capacity with the national standard bodies to engage with stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So the CCC was established via the RTC prior to the establishment of Parokkil. So part of our major mandate under consumer awareness is that we lobby with competent authorities, mm-hmm. for standardization and for standards, because it's part of the consumer advocacy. So we continue to make that offer, that we will continue to do whatever is necessary to partner with the agencies, regional and international, to reach the consumer bodies. So I just wanted to put that on the table formally again. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning again. Cindy, excellent presentation. By the way, my name is Anson Robinson. I'm representing the Ministry of Financial Services in the Cayman Islands. So you mentioned Kenya as a success story. Do you have any similar success stories for countries within the region?
Not yet. So based on the UK government's priorities, there's a selected number of countries that we're working in at the moment, but we are looking forward to working in this region.
And how does a country, that's part two to my question, how do we engage in getting our country on that, in that list of that you just mentioned?
Please reach out to me and CrossQ, and we will see what we can do together. But thank you.
SG?
Thank you. Good morning. Rodney Taylor, CTU. You mentioned some of the factors as to why there wasn't more companies weren't going after or weren't internationally certified. I didn't see cost, though you mentioned capacity, but I didn't see, is that included or in terms of the cost of actually getting these certifications, like the ISO, for example, that you mentioned, 27001, there's a cost to actually reaching that and maintaining that. So I didn't see that there mentioned specifically, but is that something that has been looked at?
That is something that certainly needs to be looked at. I mean, you hit the nail on its head, resources. It's not just human capacity, it's the financial resources. And that is something that we need to look into, and this is where we rely on partners and development banks to support us in that process. Thank you.
Hi, Simone Joseph Oliver, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I'm from the Information Technology Services Department, and we currently follow the ISO 27001 that Mr. Taylor talked about, and it is very expensive. So when he mentioned about the cost, I mean, I'm like, this is the same thing I'm thinking about now, because in as much as we would like to expand this standard to different governmental ministries and apply other standards under ISO, let's say for the health section, etc., the budget is a constraint. And we want other ministries to be following international standards as well. So I don't know how we can approach this in terms of getting funding or getting help from international donors, from CrossQ, who is right in our region. How can we get that additional support? And how can we encourage or bring awareness to other governmental ministries to see the importance of following and implementing international standards?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And I think the first step in all of this is raising the awareness and having clarity that standards are an important part of the equation. And once that is there, resources do follow, but I'm not saying that there is enough resources sitting there, to support certification. So, do get in touch, and we can talk about different ways we can explore opportunities for collaboration there, and see if there are any opportunities to leverage potential funding to support that kind of activity from development banks. But I don't know if CrossQ, Fulgence, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Right. So one of the things that I would advise St. Vincent and the Grenadines to do is to get in touch with your National Standards Bureau, right? CrossQ, the organization, what we do, we organize a number of projects, right, where we could give the necessary assistance in the development of the quality infrastructure. I know Cindy's presentation really focused on standards, but as she would have indicated during the presentation, it's not just about standards. You need the other quality infrastructure institutions to underpin the standards, right? She would have mentioned metrology, and we do give assistance to the National Metrology Institute in the various member states to develop capacity. The same thing for conformity assessment, which is really crucial in terms of implementation of standards. So we could always talk to your director, Mr. Ezra Ledger, and he would contact us, and we try to develop projects to try to give the necessary capacity building to the NSBs and to promote quality infrastructure generally in member states, right? It is a real problem promoting, but first of all, we need to get to those policymakers, right? And so we always encourage the NSBs to engage the policymakers, engage government, because one of the things Cindy would have mentioned is the adoption of international standards. But to adopt international standards, you would have to be a member of the International Standards Institution, organization, right? But the NSBs always see it as being a very costly venture, right? To be a member of those organizations. So we always ask that they engage the policymakers, let the funding come from government. In fact, if the government understood the importance of quality infrastructure and the importance of a National Standards Bureau in facilitating the growth and development of the quality infrastructure, right, then they would give the necessary financial support to the institution. One of the things that we can always do is to show the importance, the cost benefit of implementation of standards. Yes, when you first implement or about to implement, it might be a little costly, but the benefits outweighs the cost. And that is what is important, to show the benefits of implementing standards and standards-related activity to institution to increase the competitiveness of business, right, and the general economic development of the member state. I think that's where we have to go, and we assist the members, we assist the National Standards Bureau in doing such. And we could always have a conversation during the course of this day, right, and see how we could approach the problem that you would have identified. Thanks.
Thank you for that. We do have one final question, and that is from our online audience. This is from Christopher Chinapu. Great presentation as usual, Cindy. There's also the argument that standards stifle innovation. What are your thoughts on how we can ensure that the benefits are derived?
Great question. I feel, well, as I mentioned in the presentation, standards do not stifle innovation because they allow you to realize the benefits of innovation through agile standardization processes. It's not about just realizing the value at the end, but there are agile processes to make sure that that one can realize the benefits at an earlier stage. And obviously, standards don't exist in a vacuum. There is intellectual property as well. So it's two sides of the same coin. And we need to just realize, in order to further innovation, standardization is a critical element to that end. Thank you.
Vashti, if I could just intervene here.
Yes, please.
To add something different. The fact that standards, like we see, promote innovation. Standards these days are not prescriptive, right? It is performance-based. And so you could come up with innovative ways to develop a product, but at the end of the day, the product have to perform in a particular manner. And so that's where the innovation aspect comes into play. So they don't tell you exactly how you must do that product, but how that product must perform at the end of the process. And that's where you could include innovation and in the standardization process. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for an excellent presentation. Let's give her a round of applause. I now have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Chris Southworth, if you can put up his bio. He's a man of many talents, wearing many hats. He is the Secretary General at the International Chamber of Commerce for the United Kingdom and a regular voice for business in the international media. He is also the co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Board at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, co-founder of the UK Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation, and the ICC representative to the Commonwealth. I'd like to invite to the podium Mr. Chris Southworth.
Thanks, Vashti. Try and get a handle on the tech here before I get started. Somebody else doing that? Are you? Let me just take you back to the beginning here. There we go. So you've just seen the presentation, I can sit down now. So it's a pleasure to be here, first and foremost. I mean, what a wonderful location it is in Barbados. It's got to be right up there with one of the most beautiful parts of the world, I think. I'm here really in my capacity to talk about trade, so it's been really interesting listening to the conversation yesterday, and it certainly grounds the mind in terms of where does trade fit in the broader context of digital economies, particularly in a complex environment like the Caribbean. But just for the sake of my session here today, I'm just going to focus in on that trade piece. Great presentation from Cindy. I'm going to pick up on the standards piece as well and why that's important. And yes, there are lots of reasons why we should adopt standards to drive innovation, and I'll hopefully touch on some of that. So we have an outrageous goal at the ICC to digitalize 60 to 80% of world trade by 2026. It's outrageously ambitious, which is one of the reasons why I like it. But it really focuses the mind on the opportunity that lies right in front of us. Just to let me explain a little bit about ICC and who we are, because I think that's important context. We're a large organization. We're the largest world business organization, founded in 1919. We represent 45 million companies in 100 different countries. So we're large, and we have a terrific amount of support from companies of all sizes and sectors. We're not speaking on behalf of the big companies. We're not speaking on behalf of the big economies, we're speaking on behalf of everybody. And our primary goal here is to make trade work for everyone. It's more inclusive, more accessible, lower cost, more access to finance, and so on. The key initiative in the context of digitalization of world trade is the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. That was set up in 2020, partly on the back of the ICC Digital Trade Roadmap, which I'm going to show you in a minute, which we published in 2017. And its goal is really to act as a convening point to bring all the standards bodies together, to bring all the multilateral banks together, to bring the international institutions and governments together with industry to start to harmonize and accelerate the digitalization of the world trading system. And it was set up by 5 founding organizations, all listed up on the screen there. There are 2 really important boards that sit within the Digital Standards Initiative, and this is just to give you a flavor of who's involved. One is called the Industry Advisory Board. That body is responsible for now harmonizing all of the global standards that sit across the trade ecosystem to agree the framework for which standards you apply in which parts of the system, and I'll come to that in a little bit later in terms of the standards toolkit. The second, which is what I'm a co-chair of, is the Legal Reform Advisory Board, and that's the bit I'm going to really focus on you because you are primarily a government audience with a clear ask of what we're asking all governments to do. And as you can see, a great plethora of major institutions, including the Commonwealth. Vashti is a member of that board, where we are leading the campaign right across the world now to remove legal barriers to the digitalization of commercial trade documents. That's our first priority, to make the system go paperless. So why digitalize trade? Well, for me, there are sort of 4, there's lots of reasons to digitalize trade, is the short story, but for me, there are 4 basic cases for this. One is cost. The cost of trade at the moment is excessively high for no other reason that we are absolutely swamped in paper. 4 billion documents are floating around the trade system at any given time. If you speak to any of the big banks, they're dealing with millions of documents, even within that single bank, never mind the corporates and everybody else. It's a ridiculously old, antiquated system, and it's old and antiquated for one simple reason, that we're operating on laws that go back to the 1800s and were designed not for digital. So all we're asking really now is to upgrade those laws and allow those documents to be digitalized so that we can be faster, cheaper and simpler, and just get rid of all of that paper. You'll see the numbers in a minute, and I'll explain why those numbers are so big, but it's directly related to that first priority. Second is the trade finance gap. We've had a persistent trade finance gap of $1.7 trillion ever since 2008, when the financial crisis happened. The regulators came in, clamped down on the market, and what they did is they bundled the regulations for trade finance in with all the other regulations for higher risk finance. Trade finance is a zero to low risk financial activity. It's been proven so for over 10 years by ICC data. There is no evidence whatsoever why we should be treating it as high risk finance. And the cost is that we can't get working capital to SMEs because the banks and fintechs are all wrapped up in all this bureaucracy from paper-heavy trade. Thirdly, in terms of fraud, tax, a more secure system. How do we tackle fraud? Well, surprise, surprise, that's about implementing simple tools like legal entity identifiers, digital identities on a standardized basis. It's about implementing smarter technology solutions. There is no reason why we should be dealing with the size of fraud in the trade market as we are. There was a huge case in the UK just 2 weeks ago of 500 million pounds, 20 different requests to banks. The only reason that happened was because those banks couldn't see where the funding requests were to the other banks. So they all financed the activity. It was clearly fraudulent. It could have been completely prevented. It was totally unnecessary. If we digitalize that ecosystem around the financial services, we can actually eliminate a lot of that and shut the fraudsters out of the trade system altogether. And then fourthly, which is important in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, is we can't deliver net zero, nature positive global value chains. We've all committed to do that through the Paris Accord and the Montreal Biodiversity Agreement. We can't deliver that objective until we digitalize the trade system, because the key information we need in order to know what is sustainable and what is not, what the goods are, who owns the goods, who's paying for the goods, where those goods are from, are all buried on paper documents all over the world in 1,000 different systems. We've got to get that system, that data into a digitalized ecosystem so we can aggregate the data, we can integrate it with the wider sustainability measures, impact measures and data systems. Then we can say, okay, what's sustainable, what's not, how do we mitigate the impacts? Very, very important in the long term. So the digital trade roadmap, I'm sorry if the text is a little bit small here. You don't need to, these slides will be readily available for everybody, by the way. So this is just to set out what's the problem we're trying to solve here. Well, down the left-hand side, that's trade today. Anyone who's in trade will know exactly what I'm talking about here. For lots of policymakers, completely unaware that trade operates in this kind of way. It's totally antiquated, as I've already said. There are sometimes up to 27 to 30 to 40 trade documents in any transaction. Transactions can take on average up to 2 to 3 months to transact because everybody's bouncing pieces of paper left, right, and center. It's incredibly slow. And ultimately, only 1% of bills of lading are in digital form. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second big problem, so the first problem, sorry, is legal reform. I'll come to that. The second big problem is the standards piece, digital islands. Now, in our consumer lives, we all use mobile phones, everything connects to everything, and we can exist in a digital economy for the most part. In the trade world, you can't do that. No systems don't talk to each other because there's no standardized data formats. There's no way of moving commercial trade information in any simplified form. The only solution to that is to get a standardized, harmonized system into place. And then thirdly, the trade finance gap, which I've already talked about. Now, the future is the complete reverse, and everything I'm describing in the middle column is already happening. It's just not happening at scale, and that's where we need your help in terms of legal reform. It's completely interoperable. Systems and processes are talking to each other across the private sector and public sector. There's no paper involved in any of this. Transactions are happening in minutes, not months. Transaction costs, trade transaction costs will be reduced 80%. Half the trade finance gap evaporates, and so on and so forth. So what's the economic prize here? Well, there's a terrific study done by Vashti's team at the Commonwealth just last year. The economic prize is 1.2 trillion. 2 trillion if you combine that with customs digitalization. It's absolutely huge. It's twice the trade target for the Commonwealth by 2030, on top of the other benefits I've already mentioned, around 80% cut in trade transaction costs, 50% cut in the trade finance gap, 35% uptake in SME efficiency, and then cross-border compliance time processing, that sort of cross-border complexity piece, dropping from 25 to 1 day, 25 days to 1 day. It's huge. And then those numbers all go up when you start talking in the G7, it's 9 trillion. And then in the UK alone, it's 25 billion in terms of trade growth, and 224 billion in terms of efficiency savings. It's huge. It dwarfs, this initiative dwarfs every other trade initiative on the table in the world today. It's that big. Primary beneficiaries, by the way, are SMEs and small island economies, where the cost of trade can sometimes exceed the value of trade, and SMEs who feel the pinch, the pain of paper the most. So we're not talking about benefiting big companies here or big economies, we're talking about everybody. So I'm just going to share here a little bit of a timeline, just to give you a sense of the acceleration here. We've been talking about digitalization of trade for decades, but as you can see in the black down the left-hand side there, lots of good initiatives. We'll have Luca talking about the UNCITRAL model law and electronic transferable records at 1 o'clock today. Fantastic piece of work and a game changer. But in the last 3 years, we've achieved more than the last 18. And that's a sign that the private sector is really locking in on this issue now with governments and realizing that all of this system that we operate in needs to change, and it needs to change fast. So what's the call to action to all of you? It's very simple. Firstly, we need to remove the legal barriers to the handling of commercial trade documents. Those are written in law, and we need your help on behalf of governments to remove those barriers. Secondly, we need to align our legal systems to the UNCITRAL model law and electronic transferable records. That's the global framework for the handling of commercial trade documents in digital form. That gives us alignment. That means the information can flow, and that means the whole system can go digital. And then in the case of the Commonwealth, we've got a fantastic opportunity in April at the cluster meetings, and then in June, meeting ministers to put this into the roadmap into a fully integrated digital economy approach so that the trade systems across the Commonwealth can all go digital. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about this in the Commonwealth is I believe this network can accelerate digitalization of trade faster than any other network in the world, for the simple reason that a lot of us share the same base trade law. It often doesn't vary. It's word for word, copy and paste in a lot of countries. So we can accelerate that change far faster than others who have to go country by country in quite a lot of complexity. So what is the interoperable legal framework? Well, Luca's going to talk about this at 1 o'clock. The only reason I'm putting this up is just to give you a very clear sight of what documents we're talking about. There are 8 documents that are in paper form at the moment. These are not customs documents, they're not trade facilitation documents. These are the real heart of trade. It's the documents that refer to the ownership of the goods. Those are the ones that are on paper, and those are the ones that we need to go digital. And then down the right-hand side, to go back to that target, which sounds outrageous, but we're actually on track to cover the world in an interoperable legal framework where those commercial documents can be handled in digital form. There are already 7 countries aligned. The G7 is moving fast and all committed and in the process of removing legal barriers. The UK will be first in May and June, but there's a whole swathe of other countries. There's 86 countries at the WTO in e-commerce negotiations. Another question for all of you, are you involved in those negotiations? If you are, then there's a commitment to the Melita framework in that text. Please support it, it's really important. And then you've got groups of countries now integrating, including the UN, integrating the Melita commitment into existing frameworks. Is there technical support available? Yes. Multilateral development banks, most of them are all in the Legal Reform Advisory Board. We already have 3 projects up and running. Our goal is to have 10 up and running by the end of the year. But those banks are really key partners for you if you're looking for technical assistance in order to identify exactly what the legal problem is in your legal frameworks and support you to remove those legal barriers. And then we have a Centre for Digital Trade Innovation legal task force in the UK, which we set up specifically for the Commonwealth. We're just completing our first project in Thailand, which is not the Commonwealth, obviously, but it's there to help you. We understand the issue, and then obviously in the local area, the Inter-American Development Bank. And then there's a whole pile of policy tools. There's an ICC guide to legal reform for anyone who's interested in that. There's a whole bunch of interesting parliamentary hearings from the UK Electronic Trade Documents Bill. I'd highly recommend watching those. You get a real sense of where the politicians are at in their thinking on this. Very, very interesting. And then a question to everybody here, is the UK Electronic Trade Documents Bill a template? Question. I don't know, but I know it's an opportunity. It's taken 4 years to develop it. We believe that now countries can do that in 12 to 18 months. They don't need to go through the pain that we went through to identify the problem. For anyone who's using English law as a base law, then we believe there is an opportunity here to at least look at this piece of legislation, tweak it, adapt it, use it, copy it, whatever. The base law doesn't change, by the way. The Bills of Exchange Act in 1882 is a brilliant piece of law. It doesn't change. The Carriage of Goods by Sea Act is a great piece of law. That doesn't change. The only thing this piece of law does really is put commercial trade documents in digital form on the same legal footing as paper documents. We're not saying get rid of paper. We're saying digital is the same as paper. It's a very smart piece of law, and it's surprisingly short. It's a page and a half, no more. It's brilliant, brilliant piece of law. So if you want any help on that, you want any sort of support on that, please do get in contact. We've got the English or the Law Commission for England and Wales are fully supportive of this initiative. And then we've also got a surprisingly large group of Commonwealth countries already involved in this activity. We've got a group who are already aligned to the Melita framework. We've got another group who are already committed to it. And our hope is that we can scale that at the ministerial meeting in June so that everybody can benefit and the Commonwealth can take a lead. So just a quick zip through, because there are 3 key frameworks here. The legal framework is the one for governments to watch. The rulebook for business is the ICC Uniform Rules on Digital Trade Transactions. Not necessarily important for you if you're not from the private sector, but these are the guide rails for business. It's a new rulebook from the ICC. It's very forward thinking, and it's fully integrated with the Melita framework. And then the big one is the standards toolkit. The ISO are a big part of this, by the way, along with the other major international standards bodies. This sets out exactly what standards you need to adopt. So for any company who's trying to standardize processes, their first problem is, which standard do I adopt? Far too many standards bodies are going out there saying, we're the standard. That's no help whatsoever in a cross-border environment where we just need to know it's this standard or that standard. Then we can link and connect our systems processes across the trading system. This toolkit does that. It's the equivalent of Apple and Microsoft sitting down, getting sensible, and then connecting their systems. And anyone who's old enough to remember what the world looked like before that, that's how we're living in the trade system. This toolkit is that same moment for trade. It's obviously more complex than 2 companies, but this is super important. And there's a lot more resources to come. Just a cautionary note to finish on. Don't go for a patchwork approach. There are some good examples of that happening or happened, and they didn't lead to any transformation whatsoever. Germany is one where they digitalized transport documents only. Didn't lead to any change in the system because they missed off the other commercial trade documents. Korea is another good example, great promissory note market there, but didn't lead to change. Japan is another one along those lines. And then the big one on trade and customs and trade facilitation is, and this is not just the EU, but the EU is the best example of it, where you've got the most sophisticated customs market, but even with all of that investment, only 1% of commercial trade documents are handled in digital form. It's crazy. And that's because they missed the commercial documents, which is the most important piece of the trade system. And then we're also seeing technologies come into the market, good technologies, good solutions, good ideas, but they're failing because they're all hitting legal barriers when they cross over the borders. And that's why they're going under. We'll see more of those technology solutions go under, but it's a concern to us where we're seeing good investment going in, but we're not seeing enough emphasis from governments to say, get rid of the barriers and enable the market. It's really, really important. And then just a final word on implementation. Do have a thought that once those legal barriers or that legal reform is in process, you need to start to think about how do you implement a fully digitalized, standardized system. And to do that, you really need the help of industry to help pinpoint governments as to what the problem is and how to work through those problems and remove the barriers. And there's some really good examples now of industry-led initiatives. We've got the Centre for Digital Trade Innovation in the UK, but the Paris Europlace is on fire at the moment. They're doing some brilliant work in France. And then closer on this patch is ICC Mexico, which is actually the more common approach, where they've got industry in a working group working with industry at large, but also with government. ICC Mexico, by the way, are the coordinating body for the whole Americas if you're interested in engaging in the ICC family. And then on the government side, talking about the digital divide, my concern is not about developed and developing markets in the context of trade digitalization. I'm concerned that all of us in the West are totally behind the East. They're a long, long way ahead in places like the ASEAN. All of us need to catch up, whether you're in Europe, US, Caribbean, doesn't matter where you are, we're all playing catch up at the moment. So there's a big job to do, but a massive opportunity as well, particularly in the Commonwealth, that 1.2 trillion. But these government agencies are well worth looking at. I think that's the future. When we're dealing with these two agencies, their technical capability is first class, and they're really able to understand exactly what's going on in that private sector system and develop the policies and support their government strategies in order to digitalize the whole digital economy, but specifically trade in this context. So thank you very much. Bit of a skip through, but I hope that's given you a quick run through. Most important call here is really please help us remove those legal barriers. It's such a small area of law, so technical, but it's so important to commercial business. And I think if you look at the past, the reason it hasn't happened, and I speak as a former government official, by the way, is it's slightly out of sight of a typical government kind of remit. You're looking at customs, you're looking at trade from a government perspective, not realizing that in this commercial track, which is the lion's share of trade, there's real problems that need government help. And I think that's the reason why we've missed it out in the past, both at the WTO and at national government level. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent presentation. Just 2 points to note. The whole providing legal recognition of paper documents in electronic form, in lawyer speak, we call it electronic equivalence in terms of drafting. And, you know, it's an interesting takeaway with regard to the agencies. Perhaps you have given us a lot of information. Perhaps one of the things we can tell you is that there's possibly room for an ICC Caribbean. And on that note, I can open the floor to any questions that you may have. Eshi?
We need a microphone here.
Adopting as a standard for Caribbean or for, you know, the wider region, the Americas perhaps?
It's an interesting point that we're going to publish. There's a number of things being published by the Digital Standards Initiative over the coming months, and one of those is an index. So we're very conscious that it's very hard to know what countries where, what model laws lead to what. You know, what's the journey that you go on in order to digitalize trade? And These kind of frameworks, there are a series of model laws. There's the e-commerce readiness assessments that were mentioned earlier on by UNCTAD. They're all brilliant initiatives, and they're all stepping stones to that final goal of full digitalization. That's the way we're looking at it. The simple message is we need to get on the journey and we need to start the process. What I'm highlighting here is the most important of all, and it's the piece that's been missing. It's all of those electronic transferable records is the legal term. You'll hear Luca talking about that at 1 o'clock. I call them commercial trade documents because that's basically what they are in business terms. But I think I wouldn't discount any other frameworks. They're all important. But the Melita framework is a holistic approach. It removes all of those barriers in one fell swoop, and it means that innovation can come into the market. And to the point on innovation earlier on, by the way, some really interesting side benefits to this. I'll give you an example of what's going on in the UK. We used to have a promissory note market. Promissory notes are basically an IOU. That's all they are. It's really, really simple. Very quick, very cheap, very easy to kind of manage. That market evaporated in the 1980s for whatever reason. Now with this new piece of legislation, it's coming back. And we realize that local authorities are moving a lot of government money to and fro across different local authorities and local jurisdictions. And at the moment, they're using bonds and loans. Really complicated, far too expensive, and it doesn't really achieve anything except getting money from A to B. If you use promissory notes, not only can you get money from A to B much faster, you can put those on the market and raise money and to drive local investment, drive local growth, just by simply using a different tool. It's a new financial instrument. I think we'll see a lot more of that. So it's not just about digitalization of the trade system, it's about opening up opportunities for innovation, new technologies, more fintechs, more intermediaries to come into the market. We're certainly seeing a lot of those in the UK, whether it's trade, I call them trade techs, fintechs, insurtechs, regtech, lawtech, loads of them, different sort of sub-communities. But they're really coming into the market at speed now because they're starting to see these signals that there are spaces in order to get out to those new communities that we haven't really been able to touch before.
I do have a question from Sandra Seeley. Lots of benefits to digitalization, but what happens to the unconnected? Will moving to 100% digital decrease the customer base?
It's a good question, that. I mean, I think, the fundamentals, actually, that's why I made a couple of comments last night when we were talking over drinks, that I was actually really impressed by the statistics in the earlier presentation yesterday, that I think the adoption rates and the internet connectivity is actually really strong here. It's a lot better than other parts of the world. I mean, I appreciate there is diversity in places like Suriname. I get that, big rural geographies. But on the whole, it's pretty good. And so that means that the baseline here, the foundations, if you like, are there. In other parts of the world, we really do need to work on that digital connectivity, because if you don't have the internet, obviously this isn't going to help you very much. And if we're really talking about financial inclusion, that's really, really fundamental. But from a business perspective, cost is also, data cost has got to come down. It's outrageously expensive in some parts of the world. So I don't see these as mutually exclusive. I think we've got to get, obviously, internet connectivity and data costs down. But I think we've got to also start to think a little bit further ahead than that and start to get in place the frameworks that are going to enable business to drive growth. It's not wait for one and then do the other one in 10 years' time. We can't do that. The more you wait, the more we all get left behind. We've got to sort of, be a bit more sophisticated and do these things at the same time.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, hi, good day. Renard Penn, BVI Attorney General's Chambers. I had a question for you. During your slide deck, you highlighted some of the potential savings from digitization. And one of the things that wasn't clear from that was where that savings is. Is that in the commercial market or on the government side in terms of implementing all of this digitization and how much the change in infrastructure on the government side is going to cost? Where was that savings being articulated from?
Yeah, it's a good question. That I get asked this question a lot. Why are those numbers so big? And my simple answer is, it doesn't matter what you believe in the numbers. You could cut them in half, you can cut them in 75%, they're still big numbers. And any government who's got tight public finances right now, those look attractive in terms of driving growth, right? So that's the way I look, broadly speaking, in the numbers. The numbers are from the private sector, but we are very conscious that in the government sector, there's a world of complexity and cost there too, right? Whether it's public procurement systems, you know, in the UK as an example, you got 35 government agencies and departments interacting with borders. None of them have interoperable systems. So it's just copy, paste, repeat, duplicate. You know, it's just insane amount of complexity there, wrapping up, you know, government resources and taxpayers' money at the end of the day for no reason whatsoever. So I think actually the benefits for government, we underplay because we're very focused on the business sector, but actually I think the benefits for efficiency savings in government is huge too. So we shouldn't underestimate that. But primarily those numbers are simply because of all this paper going to and fro, check. It's absolutely madness when we could just be doing that at the click of a button through better use of technology. That's why the numbers, and don't forget too, right, the system is designed really for the 1800s because that's the law we're operating on. So the numbers are huge because you're leaping from the 1800s system straight into the 21st century. Now that sounds crazy, but that's basically what's happening here. We're just allowing modern technology to come in and be utilized at scale.
Thank you, Chris. I believe that there's another question. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kay Seeley. I'm the Director of Foreign Trade here in Barbados. You mentioned the whole issue of costs, but I was wondering what kind of support would have been offered to the micro businesses in the transition to implementing digital documents, because it can be a little costly for them.
Yeah, that's a good question too. Look, I think we're having this conversation in the UK. I mean, our message, so there's different audiences here, right? And, you know, I look at this as if you imagine we're an icebreaker. We're right up front carving the way for a much cheaper, faster, simpler system for SMEs. We know they're the beneficiaries at the end, but right now we've got to carve a path for them. The message to SMEs, so that's the message to governments, is help us remove the legal barriers. We'll get on with the standards piece. Let's get the systems into place so that SMEs can benefit. When you turn that around to an SME audience, our message is really simple. Just get started. Well, first of all, digitalization is happening. Back to that timeline, that we're not talking about this stuff anymore. It's actually happening. And so if you want to keep up with the pace, then now's the moment to get started. So our message is simply get started, start to get familiarized with the technology solutions that are in the market. There's no issue with technology here, by the way. That's a red herring in a big way. But just get started on that road. We know that there are lots of SMEs out there who are not digital at all. They're still operating completely in paper. Some of them are sort of hybrid. Some of them are really sophisticated. So depending on where their starting point is just keep moving in that direction and accelerate that investment as much as you possibly can. And for those who are really ready, we're not far off now going fully digital, and then you can actually really reap the rewards. And the big challenge, of course, here is to change behavior. We know full well that, you know, we've been in a trading system for decades and centuries. It's not going to be the click of a finger and suddenly everyone's going to go digital. It's going to take time for all of us to work together. And that goes back to the models I mentioned earlier, why public-private partnerships are so important here. You know, if it's industry-led, government-supported, that's our tagline, really, then we can all go to industry, especially SMEs, and give that really affirmative message that we are all investing in this system to make it better for them. And that gives them the confidence to invest in new technology solutions. So that's the sort of message to SMEs. And then eventually, of course, they'll be able to just utilize the system and won't even be thinking about it. I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Actually, we have lots of questions, but I would advise that you can take it up over a wonderful cup of coffee as we now proceed to move to the coffee break. Everyone is invited to enjoy the light refreshments that are being served outside, and we can reconvene in the next 10 minutes. If that's okay, you are allowed to bring your drinks and your light eats inside. Thank you very much. On your table, you'll find your nice Valentine's Day presents from our team. And speaking of sharing the love, we're going to hand over to a very bright and dynamic young lady, Sophie Maddens, who is going to present this morning. Her session is entitled Bringing the Pieces Together, the Importance of Regional Harmonization. And I'm just pulling up her bio now. Sophie Maddens is the head of the Regulatory and Market Environment Division of the ITU. She is a lawyer in training and has worked as a regulatory and policy expert in the telecommunications sector in international and multicultural environments. Many of you may actually be familiar with Sophie because she was one of the key persons who led the HIPCAR project within the Caribbean, and I'm sure she's going to talk about this project as well as several of her other initiatives this morning. I'll hand over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Vashti. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having invited me to this wonderful workshop. It really is a blast from the past. You said a wonderful young lady. I used to be young when I worked on the HIPCAR. Now I just celebrated my 60th birthday. But it does mean that I've been in the sector for over 30 years. And we've seen a lot of changes, as we've heard in the last couple of days. Some of the items that I'd like to touch upon is really that the digital environment, and we've heard it over the last few days, it really is global in nature. Think of internet users. They can typically view websites and content from anywhere in the world, subject to copyright or other limitations. We've talked about global e-commerce. That enables buyers in one country to purchase goods and services from sellers in another country. With online communications, people can video conference, call, and message for free or at relatively low cost, regardless of location and borders. And billions of these transactions occur daily, and it involves every sector. We've heard about this cross-sectoral collaboration. We've seen it. I think that's a key issue to think of when we're talking about this digital transformation. And it's been very interesting to look at the areas and subjects that we do need to address, because we're not just talking about ICT telecoms, just voice communications anymore. We're talking about voice, data, image. And so we do have these cross-border issues, data protection, privacy, consumer protection, but also public safety and national security. So that governments, policymakers, regulators have found that national laws, that harmonization of national laws, it really is even more important now than 30 years ago when I started, so that everybody can access the global markets and realize the benefits of the global economy. I always say I am who I am because of digital. I'm a mother, I'm a wife. I used to be a daughter, unfortunately, I lost both my parents. I'm a sister, I'm a friend, I'm a professional, and digital has enabled me to be what I am. But we heard, Cindy, this morning, we need those workable international standards that can promote regulatory harmonization. It can enable industry players to leverage the economies of scale to better deliver those new technologies and services and avoid a patchwork of regulations that can be contradictory from one country to another. We've heard time and time again over these last couple of days that contradiction is not good, especially for small markets. So we really want to look at the institutional collaboration model to encompass collaboration at the global, regional, and national level, that cross-sectoral collaboration. And I saw Helen yesterday, I don't know if she's online today, but we did work together on digital financial inclusion, where together we brought ICT and financial services regulation together to really have an impact in national implementation, focusing on 3 countries in particular in our work on Egypt, Mexico, and China. And we really worked on infrastructure, but also consumer protection and some of these other issues. So in my presentation, I'll look at these national and international and regional commitments and the impact thereof, starting with the GATS. I'll talk a little bit about HIPCAR and my friend Cleveland, my friend and colleague, but first and foremost, my friend Cleveland and I worked very hard on the HIPCAR project way back when, Cleveland, when we were still young and energetic. And so Cleveland can pitch in, of course, and provide you with any further information he has, because obviously as the area office representative here, I bow to him for advice on the region. But then I'll go into some of the telecoms regulation, and then the digital transformation as well, and look at the impact of regulation, the economic impact of regulation, and set the scene for the panel that Rodney then will moderate for us. So when I started my career with the GATS negotiations, the Uruguay round, the Doha round, countries and regions made global and regional commitments to open their telecommunications markets, to harmonize the local legislation with that of other countries, to encourage foreign investment in the sector, and to leverage investment in downstream sectors relying on ICT. And those commitments, we saw them serve to accelerate regulatory reform, with specific focus on facilitating global or regional best regulatory practices and providing telecoms investors with a level of certainty and predictability. So if we look at the GATS commitments, when the 69 member nations of the World Trade Organization agreed to open their markets to companies from other WTO members, this was back in 1997, they also adopted a document that was unique. It was really unique, the reference paper on regulatory principles. We had an annex that established that each WTO member state shall ensure that service suppliers of any other member are accorded access to and use of public telecom transport network and services on reasonable and non-discriminatory terms and conditions for the supply of a service included in its schedule. And then the reference paper was negotiated based on an understanding of the nature of what was then telecoms markets. In particular, that even when open to competition, it's essential that the market be regulated in order to allow new entrants to compete with entrenched incumbent operators referred to as major suppliers. So a country making those commitments had to modify its laws and regulations to ensure compliance with these obligations. And I've worked in countries way back when, in the late 90s, early 2000, I actually worked in a country in the Middle East, in Jordan, and they thought, oh, no, we can continue with our monopoly operator. This is just a commitment. No, it's not. It was a commitment that was important, and they had to abide by the commitment they made. They had to liberalize and open their market and reshape and reform their telecommunications sector. So they are a treaty obligation, and it does necessitate changes in domestic law and regulations. Some countries had already made those changes before making the commitments, but others got really wound up in these negotiations, made the commitments, and then said, oops, I made these commitments, now I have to make the reforms. So what was unusual about the telecom sector is that a number of WTO members made basic telecom commitments between 1997 and 2002 outside of the context of the round of negotiations, because it was really important. It was important because the reference paper provided a blueprint of best practice for countries designing telecoms policy, legislation, and regulation. also for countries that wanted to join the WTO. So it was a minimum common denominator of regulatory practices that was being built amongst the WTO member countries. And it also was used as a template for bilateral and regional trade agreements. And some regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, were improved or were tweaked based on these GATS instruments. And don't take it lightly, because multinational companies take these GATS commitments seriously. They're well informed of the rights and benefits to which GATS actually entitles them. There was a case, the Mexico case, that suggested that suppliers are likely to increasingly use GATS commitments to secure markets and pursue GATS benefits. So it is important, and it is a big deal. And foreign investment follows such commitments. So one of the things I've been working with the WTO Secretariat, and it's very important, and that will come to one of the other points that I have in my presentation later on. When we're looking at this digital transformation, we're not just talking about infrastructure anymore. We're talking about access, adoption, and value creation. And for that, the digital transformation means that all sectors need to work together. And when you have these regional commitments and these regional negotiations, it means that you need to keep your trade negotiators up to par with what is happening in the digital sphere and how digital impacts the economies, how digital impacts agriculture, health, education, all of these other sectors, finance, they're impacted by digital, and your trade negotiators need to be aware of that, because they need to be aware of where this impact lies. So some of the key principles of the reference papers, they seem old, but yet they're still relevant. We have the independent regulatory authority. And independent doesn't mean the Wild West. There is accountability, there is transparency, there is process. So independent means that it must be independent in its day-to-day functional, structural, and financial independence. But we see across the world that there is the reporting, sometimes reporting to the Prime Minister, to the Parliament, but there is that accountability. It also that means the fair market. We need that transparency and the fairness in the market. We also need that interconnection and interoperability. The finance folks that are here know very well we need that interoperability, and for that we need interconnection. We need the public availability of some core principles and criteria, one of which was identified in the WTO reference paper as the licensing criteria. If we think way back to the 80s and 90s, when we started opening up the markets, when we went from the monopoly or from government-owned entities that were providing telecom services to new players on the market started opening very gradually, starting here in the Caribbean with the value-added services. There were loopholes that were found, but you needed those transparent licensing criteria, which doesn't mean you need heavy-handed licensing principles and processes. You can have what the Americans called unlicensed, but unlicensed doesn't mean unregulated. You need the flexible and agile regulation to allow that innovation, to now allow new market players. But you need to keep in mind that at the very end of the day, it's about people. So at the very end of the day, quality of service and consumer protection are key. So even if it's when it's unlicensed, there are some basic principles there, but you need that public availability of those licensing criteria. We heard yesterday from Annie about universal service. That was already in the reference paper. Administer universal service programs in a transparent, non-discriminatory, and competitively neutral manner. Again, that hasn't changed. We need to allocate and assign the use of scarce resources, looked at as numbering, spectrum, and rights of way, and again in an objective, timely, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner. So those were the key principles in the reference paper. Now, if we look at the regional commitments, so we looked at the global commitments, the regional commitments, the regional institutions, we're looking at CTU, we're looking at regional institutions. They can also be very useful for policy making, training, technical assistance, research. Data is key. Evidence-based decision-making is key. And with ITU, I'm really pleased to hear how many of you reference ITU. We have great data, and we are ready and willing to work with the Commonwealth Secretariat, with CTU, to share our data, to have you help us ensure that we have the correct and up-to-date data, because evidence-based decision-making is key. And also the advocacy so that you in your respective governments can advocate for the importance of digital. And fortunately, one of the good things of COVID is that it hit us all in the face. Digital is important. If we would not have had digital, that lockdown, excuse my American slang, would have sucked, because we would have been locked down away from our jobs. Our kids would not have been able to continue their education. And even though it was challenging, you had the harms that were there, but still looking at the importance of digital and the challenges and opportunities of digital really became key. And I was really excited to see how much it came to the forefront, and excited that an institution like ITU was recognized for its importance. The work that we do was recognized for its importance. But one of the things as well, we've seen COVID, but we've also seen geopolitical challenges. And one of the things we must avoid is knee-jerk reactions. Balkanization of infrastructure firms, balkanization of the internet, especially amongst smaller states, can reduce the effectiveness of reforms. Because when markets naturally cross national borders, regional regulatory agreements and authorities, those agreements amongst neighboring countries for the mutual recognition of infrastructure operators, can facilitate the development of a seamless and competitive network. So looking at the regional integration of regulation combined with the regionalization of regulated firms, it can help us overcome national limits. It can enhance the national capacity to make credible commitments. It can facilitate the introduction of competition into historically monopolized market. We've seen it here in the region. We have the big guys that kept their power for long periods of time. And these commitments really helped the smaller markets to say, it's about the people. We need reform. We need the innovator to bring these services to our people so that the digital economy can benefit all, so that we can have affordable, available, and accessible communications to our people. So it also improves the efficiency of infrastructure industries by allowing them to grow without respecting economically artificial national boundaries. And I do believe that regional integration of reform and of companies does increase infrastructure investment, because you have scale. The market comes to scale. Some of the key elements for success, we do need those clear mandates. We do need the clear resources. It doesn't help to create institutions and cut off their hands. You have to give them the financial and the human resources. We talked a lot about adoption and implementation. For implementation, you need the elbow grease, you need the resources, you need your staff to be able to go out into the world, to build their capacity, to be at these conferences, to listen to these discussions, to exchange, to learn, to exchange with peers. So looking at HIPCAR, oops, I was a bit too quick on the trigger here. Looking at HIPCAR. So HIPCAR was part of a global project, an EU project, where we looked at harmonization. It was HIPCAR in the Caribbean, HIPSA in South Saharan Africa, and ICB for PAC for the Pacific. So it was designed to support the Caribbean countries in improving their competitiveness by harmonizing approaches to ICT development. Contrary to what we did in ECOWAS and CEDEAOs in Western Africa, we didn't actually look at model telecommunications law, the holistic law, and the different elements. We started this harmonization work with ITU in West Africa, where we looked at model laws plus numbering, spectrum, interconnection, universal service, and licensing. Here we focused on three basic elements in the telecoms, and Vashti worked more on the cyber data protection side. But I'm talking about the telecom side, where we looked at universal service, licensing, and interconnection. And I know David Geary will be joining us later. I actually had a call with Andrew Gordon last week. And so we had some great people, and I see Gary and Annie here. You were there with us. With JP Morgan, bless his soul, may he rest in peace, and Kwesi Prescott as well. So we worked on these three key important issues. What did we do? It was really a lot of capacity building, a lot of exchange, a lot of knowledge exchange. So we did assessments. We looked at the gaps, and that again yesterday we saw in some of the presentation, evidence-based decision-making. Look at the gaps, look at the evidence. We looked at the gaps, we looked at the laws, and we saw where are there common points, where are the gaps, what are some of the international best practices. Then we brought all stakeholders to the table to see where can we find the commonality. And then we followed up with regional implementation, where together with Cleveland, we worked in some countries to do some of the national implementation. I was pleased to have worked here in Barbados. I worked in St. Lucia. We worked with ECTEL. We worked with a number of the countries, but obviously resources were limited. We didn't work in all the countries, but we've kept this network. And as I say, we're still friends, right, Annie? So we worked together, and we worked on these various issues. So for the assessment, the regional policy, and the regional legislation. Yes, I realize. HIPCAR 2, we did propose a HIPCAR 2. Unfortunately, again, with all the donor agencies, it's a question of resources. You have an opportunity. COVID actually made the EU understand as well the importance of strategic partnerships. We do have the EU-LAC summit coming up. Digital is not quite on the top of the list of priorities. If you look at the fiche at the EU-LAC and the Caribbean priorities in particular, because there's poverty reduction, there's a number of issues that are top of the agendas in the Caribbean. But it's up to you to go and talk to the EU delegations in your countries prior to that summit to really bring digital at the top of the agenda, because the EU is figuring out what they want to do with this Team Europe approach. You have the D4D hub, you have the GovStack, you have a number of issues that the EU is working on. In Africa in particular, we're working on mapping, we're looking at capacity building, we're looking at regulatory reform. It's up to you to go and talk to the EU delegations to bring digital to the top of that list as well. I'm just going to skim over. And Rodney, I know I have the 10 minutes threat here over my head, but I just want to skip over some of these things about the importance of regulation and the impact of regulation. I talked about the GATS. So those countries that made the GATS commitments tended to outperform those countries that did not make GATS commitments. And critical questions are, what is the impact of government policies and regulation on the performance of the ICT sector as measured by capital investment, network deployment, service pricing, consumer demand, and ultimately impact on the economy? And is competition enough an incentive to drive an improvement of sector performance? Some food for thought. The regulatory institutional framework is very key. It's linked to a positive and significant increase in telecoms investment. A reduction in taxation is also associated with a significant boost in capital investment because it increases financial resources to network deployment. A reduction of government bureaucratic processes is linked to a significant increase of capital investment, and that confirms the relevance of public efficiency. And it also highlights the importance of reducing the required time for obtaining permits. And being affiliated to international internet organizations that promote sound regulations can also enhance a business-prone environment. So if we look at this, we saw an increase of 10% in fixed broadband penetration yields an increase of 0.77% in GDP. And 3 specific policy approaches are recommended. Incorporate the economic impact of digitalization in your assessment of policies, be collaborative and quick, and be transparent. I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll just skip through this and you will have this presentation. We also saw that countries with a 5-year membership of the WTO are linked to a 17.5% more investment than non-members. So again, that's the relevance of being part of international and regional commitments. Same thing goes for the OECD. So we're going towards this digital transformation. So how has regulation evolved? We've seen along the digital transformation road, we've seen along the digital transformation road, connectivity, technology, regulatory, market, and societal changes. If we think back to the 1980s, we look at the dawn of mobile and email, to data and the global networked society, smartphones, the digitalization of new parts of society, now the help to mitigate the global pandemic, and towards 2030, we're looking at universal and meaningful connectivity for all, and the digital economy and society, those digital nations, because digital impacts all sectors and aspects of people's lives. Think of e-health, e-agriculture, e-education, e-government services, innovation services for value creation, the skills. So we need to keep abreast of the different regulatory tools. This is actually the previous slide, but I'll just talk to this, and Vashti I had updated my presentation. This is the older presentation, but I'll speak to this one, it doesn't matter. So we have these regulatory tools and approaches that are at hand for enabling that sustainable digital transformation, the pro-competition frameworks, the regulatory incentives, the stakeholder investment, the robust enforcement mechanisms, the market-based mechanisms for spectrum management, and obviously the regulatory impact assessments. So we need to bring traditional and emerging regulation into the digital area. Regulations continue to address the traditional aspects, but they have to adapt their role to the rapidly changing digital environment. So we need to assess the need to modernize. So how do we evolve and adopt regulation? As we saw, and what Chris said before, more regulation is not always better. Consider deregulation, self-regulation, or co-regulation. And consider new regulatory approaches that are really tailored to digital, to emerging technologies and innovation. So let's go from a rules-based to a principles-based approach. So how has regulation evolved? We've gone from the command and control approach to what we have minted as the G5, the 5th generation of regulation, which we call the collaborative regulation and a harmonized approach across the sectors. So what are some of our economy and regulation and policy tools? We have our ICT regulatory tracker. So it's really the evidence-based decision-making. We have the digital ecosystem portal. We have our infrastructure development portal. So there's lots of good materials there. As you all have quoted, there's lots of good material. So please do visit our website to visit our portal. And Rodney, maybe if in the panel we do have 5 minutes left, we can bring up my revised presentation, because I did have the Wheel of Digital Transformation there that looks at the ITU approach towards digital transformation, and maybe we can share it with you and we can look at that. We also have the Digital Regulation Handbook and Platform. We talk about capacity building. We've just launched our online modules on our platform. Feel free to register for those self-paced online modules. Is there a silver bullet? Well, evidence-based decision-making, know where you are in terms of access, adoption, and value creation. You need that evidence-based decision-making. Create that conducive ecosystem. Upgrade your regulatory and legal framework. Build the foundations for universal and meaningful connectivity. Address the middle and last mile as well. Don't forget to invest in people. Focus on the disadvantaged groups and anticipate the future skill needs. Don't forget partnership, partnership, partnership. And also that will allow you to kickstart and sustain the digital transformation. And that digital transformation, it's about users, technologies, and data. It's about the people. It's about the data. It's about access, adoption, and value creation. And when you look at the digital transformation, look at the institutional frameworks, the legal frameworks, the sectoral requirements, the connectivity requirements, the cybersecurity requirements, also the data, the digital skills, the digital ecosystem, the green economy, the circular economy, and innovation. Look at all of these: access, adoption, and value creation towards the digital transformation, because digital transformation is important for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for an excellent presentation. And of course, I'll be sure to pull up the presentation on the digital transformation wheel. At this time, I'd like to kindly invite any questions from our audience. Yes, please, Chris.
Just a quick question on whenever I hear the word deregulation, I start to get alarm bells ringing all over the place, because I think politicians can interpret that as bonfire of regulations, just get rid of them. And that's actually in the context of digitalization of trade, if I just keep it in that context for a moment, that's exactly what we don't want. We actually want smart regulation, not deregulation. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, and how do we present good regulatory ideas to government that then don't get interpreted the wrong way, because that's pretty dangerous in places, right?
Thank you. That was a provocative word that I put in my presentation exactly to get a reaction, and that's why I referred to it as, in inverted commas, deregulation, because I totally agree with you, Chris. We don't want the Wild West. However, we do want agile and flexible regulation, as you call it, smart regulation, which sometimes means stepping away from the heavy-handed regulation. And sometimes co-regulation or self-regulation are the tools that allow us to be smart. I hope that answers your question.
I have another question in the room. Go ahead. From the Telecommunications Authority.
Hi, Sophie, Jem from TAT. So my question follows from Chris's question. I want to know if you think, or how you think self-regulation or co-regulation can help regulators fulfill their mandate to manage spectrum.
So I think you need to make a clear distinction. So when we're talking about scarce resources, you're also talking about the public good, right? So there are certain levels or areas where, when the public safety and the public good come to bear, and where it's the mandate of the regulator to ensure that this public good is protected. There are certain areas where self-regulation or co-regulation is not appropriate. And that's what Chris mentioned. We need to be smart about regulation. We need to be agile, and we need to be flexible. So self-regulation and co-regulation can really be applied in certain areas. I would think certain areas of consumer protection, for example. But where we're looking at scarce resources, where the public interest is at hand, I would personally, as a lawyer, I would advocate let the regulator carry out their mandate. And I just want to add to that. So these provocative words, you didn't jump on my unlicensed. So unlicensed, and it's like the same thing, deregulation, unlicensed. It doesn't, deregulation or smart regulation does not mean the Wild West. It's unlicensed does not mean the Wild West. There are certain principles, certain standards, as Cindy said, that must be respected. And there are certain areas that must be protected. So when it comes to public safety, public goods, then you must ensure that you carry out your mandate. I hope that responds to the question.
To add something as it relates to that question, the whole issue of self-regulation. And from my perspective, to engage in self-regulation, you would need to have the framework in place. So I understand, like in the UK, there's systems where, for instance, businesses can do the necessary as it relates to certifying origin. But that is because you have de-risked the whole exercise to a certain extent. And you have certain systems in place, starting at the border, where you can actually track sequences and movement of goods. So there's less risk involved. So as you were saying, there are instances where you can self-regulate, there are instances where you can deregulate, but in many instances, there already is a system in place to facilitate it.
And you need the transparency. You need the process, the system, the transparency, and the accountability. Chris.
Jump in on that. I think it's a really important point around ICC is a self-regulatory body for business, effectively. We've got an enormous rule book. And when we're going across borders, we're following the ICC rules, effectively, whatever country you're in. And I think there's a strong case for self-regulation in some areas. This is a bit controversial even within ICC, but just from basic practice and the conversations we get into, in some areas there's a clear case for self-regulation, like the Standards Toolkit was a great example. The digital rules for trade transactions is another great example where we can self-regulate, we can follow those tracks and businesses will be good. But in other areas where it's quite controversial, like human rights, we tried self-regulation, it didn't work. But we know that full mandatory rules probably won't work either. So it's somewhere in between, right? It's probably a mixed economy, back to the smart regulation, co-regulation, working with business. I just think that in the more difficult areas, when we're trying to solve the same problem, it's about engagement with business and then designing regulation that works for all sides so that we get to the end goal, because we all want a net zero economy, no human rights abuses, all of those sorts of issues, and try and work together to solve them rather than saying it's either one or the other and then ping pong in between the two. It's not as simple as that. The world's a pretty complicated place. Otherwise, we would have solved these issues a long time ago.
Thank you kindly, Chris. Do we have any more questions from the audience for Sophie? On that note, I think that we can move on to our next activity, which is a panel discussion on Caribbean harmonization. I'd like to introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. Rodney Taylor, who is the Secretary General of the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. He was formerly the Chief Digital Technology Officer with Barbados' Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology, where he was the technical lead on Barbados' digital transformation, improving public sector service delivery through the strategic use of innovation, science, and smart technology. I would also hand over now to the moderator to commence the session and introduce his very esteemed panel. Over to you, Rodney.
Thank you very much, Vashti. Good afternoon, everyone. As Vashti pointed out, Rodney Taylor, Secretary General of the CTU. I'm pleased to lead this discussion on Caribbean harmonization. The CTU itself is a regional organization established since 1989 to harmonize telecommunications policy and regulations. Joining me, of course, is Sophie Maddens, who you just heard from. Excellent presentation. I was riveted to my seat as you spoke about establishing institutions and cutting off their hands. And as I sat there, I thought, that's not the only thing they cut off sometimes, you know. But it is very, very relevant, very much so to the Caribbean. And we face many challenges as we move forward, and I'll give a few examples as we begin. But we're also joined by Kay Seeley, who is the Director of Foreign Trade in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade for the government of Barbados, and also Dr. Chantal Ononawu, who is with the Director of Trade in the CARICOM Single Market, for CARICOM Single Market and Trade. One second, let me pull up the bio. Right. In the CARICOM's Secretariat Directorate of the CARICOM Single Market and Trade, I forgot that right, is based in Barbados, and she leads the Directorate's work pertaining to external trade negotiations and external trade policy. She has served as a senior advisor to the community on matters pertaining to international trade and investment, and she is a negotiator for CARICOM in its external trade negotiations. I should also tell you with respect to Kay Seeley, she is Director of Foreign Trade in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. She's a trained economist and a business administrator, and she's the principal advisor on Barbados' international trade policy. She advocates and defends Barbados' international trade policy interests in different fora at the international, regional, and bilateral level. We're also joined by Mr. David Geary, virtually. I believe he's in Ireland somewhere. David? He has over 20 years experience in telecommunications, utility regulations, antitrust law, and European affairs. He was the General Counsel of Digicel Group, where he worked in the Caribbean and the South Pacific for over a decade. He previously worked with Parokkil, the incumbent operator in Bahrain, and practiced with major law firms in Brussels and Dublin. David, can we bring David up on screen? Hi, David.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, good. You can hear us. Where are you now?
I'm in somewhere in Ireland. Indeed, I am. In Limerick in Ireland. Sorry, I can't be with you.
Yes, you're missing the wonderful sunshine here in Barbados. We're right at the beachfront resort.
Thanks.
So we're going to, David has a few slides he wants to share with us. I'll just, in opening this session, everything you said, Sophie, resonated with us. In fact, David was part of our negotiations last year to reduce roaming within CARICOM, roaming rates as we move within the CARICOM space. There's an initiative called the CARICOM Single ICT Space, and we're trying to harmonize policy and regulation around telecommunications. Of course, we signed the declaration of St. George's towards the reduction of roaming. We saw roaming charges reduced by as much as 97% on voice data and text messages. And even then, we still believe that we can go further to full elimination so that persons within the CARICOM space can roam as they're at home. The operators pointed out to several challenges to getting there, including the lack of harmonization or disparities, certainly in regulation telecoms policies as they move even within this space, and the differences in licensing regime, the fees that they pay, and so on. So we also have a responsibility to move our harmonization project further down the road. We're also dealing with another issue that came up, which is the OTT providers and the big tech companies that are competing as well with the operators in the space who are regulated, they're not regulated. And of course, to deal with these challenges, we need to take a harmonized approach within the region. So I'm going to let David start off with his presentation, and then we'll pass over to Kay and then to Chantal to give just a few opening perspectives from where they both sit. David, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rodney, and hello, everybody. Good morning from Ireland, where it is not quite as sunny, unfortunately, but I'm sorry I can't be with you at this meeting. Just as a question, if I may, Rodney, I see that on the screen I have the front page of my slides appears. Should I share my slides from my computer, or will someone move those slides forward?
We can move them forward for you.
Okay, well, if you could turn to the first slide, so please, that would be great. Thank you. So we've been working and thinking about these issues for many years now. And I suppose when we're talking about effective legal frameworks for building the digital economy in the Caribbean, a good question to start with is, where do we want to go? And I'm reminded of a campaign that the Irish government ran in the 1980s in US newspapers, which essentially, as you can see, was saying we missed the Industrial Revolution. And what it was saying was, we've already made a step change to a tech economy, and we're not encumbered by, legacy regulation and legacy legal frameworks and so on. And in a way, the Caribbean has a similar opportunity. We have a blank canvas to create a new framework for the digital economy in the region. And other regions are in the process of creating regulatory frameworks to work for them. So it's appropriate we think about what are our priorities in the Caribbean, what's important to us. To me, protection of democracy would be very high up the list. And Giuliano Amato, the former Prime Minister of Italy, in his seminal text on antitrust law, wrote that democratic societies must never permit illegitimate private power to arise. And that may seem obvious, but that is where we are at the moment. There are real threats to our democratic societies in the digital age. And digital companies, many of them already dominate not just the internet, but many aspects of our lives. And we've seen this in the Caribbean. Cambridge Analytica famously used the Caribbean to develop its data micro-targeting tools that it went on to use in the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK and the US election that year. So they used the Caribbean to experiment with democracy. And in other respects, we will also have other priorities to jurisdictions such as the US and the EU. And as an example, the US will want to see as few overseas rules as possible on its tech companies. But in the Caribbean, we need networks. And it's not clear that investment is coming for 5G and gigabit networks in this region. Caribbean governments will need to raise taxes from digital providers in the digital economy. So our interests aren't the same, they're not always aligned. And it's right that in the Caribbean, we design a framework that works for us. Now, having said that, there are different versions of the internet emerging, and the Caribbean, being a smaller region, should gravitate logically towards one or other of these. And there's different versions, as you can see. One academic has called, describe these as the Beijing paternal internet or the Silicon Valley open internet, and also has a description of the EU internet being a sort of well-ordered, self-regulating, responsible, more or less open internet, informed by legal tradition of balancing freedom and justice and fairness. And the emphasis on fundamental rights and freedoms in the constitutions of the Caribbean states, particularly the CARICOM states, aligns very closely with the approach in Europe. And it seems to me that our legal systems and our constitutional systems align on this issue in terms of digital economy, probably best with some of the norms we're seeing coming from the EU as well. So with that in mind, where do we go to next? And I'm reminded of that joke about the Irish farmer giving directions to the American tourist and saying, well, if you want to go there, you shouldn't be starting from here. And in a way, we have a similar problem in that we have a mix of sectoral rules across jurisdictions, and harmonization, in the region, hasn't been without challenge. Professor Gilbert Morris gave a very frank assessment of progress and thinking about harmonization at Canto some years ago. I won't repeat his critique, but I've left the link to it there. But essentially, he called us to think afresh and to have a bold vision for the future. If we go to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, I think it's useful also to consider the options that are definitely not on the table. And I think, doing nothing is not on the table. I think everybody agrees on that. And also taking action too slowly, which I'll come back to in a moment, is not an option either. And the risks are simply too great. So we must innovate. We must take action. And if we consider the risks, I mentioned the risks to democracy. In the region, local media is losing advertising revenue to big tech. This was addressed in other jurisdictions, Australia and Europe in particular. And we need to act to protect our free press. The EU is now looking, as Rodney mentioned, to how to fund future networks. And investors are less and less interested in investing in telecoms networks. This is a problem for the Caribbean. Are we going to get 5G networks in the Caribbean this decade? So that's somewhere where action is needed. And then another non-option, if I'd call it, is we can't simply copy what was done somewhere else. And turning to the EU, we can't just simply copy EU rules. Firstly, it won't protect our priorities. And also, it's not practical to think we're going to be able to emulate what they are doing in the EU. We have lessons from previous experience of this, such as competition law, telecommunications regulation itself, the EU approach to net neutrality, which were, in some cases totally inappropriate for the Caribbean, and in other cases, some of the norms were just not practical. So we need to apply our resources wisely in the region. We're never going to have regulators with thousands of staff. So we must choose the elements and the themes that are important for us and find a way to apply these. And also, I think we can't assume that the companies, the bigger tech companies, are going to apply the same standards globally themselves. The so-called Brussels effect, where the norms coming out of Europe become accepted globally. This may not happen, or may not happen quickly. Companies can apply different standards and have different behaviors in different regions. So we already see this in the Caribbean. We know that the tech companies follow EU rules in the French West Indies, and we know that they apply lower standards for the rest of us. Next slide, please. So timely intervention is required. We have to act. And then if we think for a moment about, again, where we are, coming back to the Irish directions, we actually do have a lot of regulatory resources in the region. The problem is the same functions are replicated, across regulators and ministries in each country. We do have constitutions that protect fundamental rights and freedoms, and acting together, the Caribbean is not of an insubstantial size. So we do have a great opportunity, but we can't delay any further. So I think, having looked at this, it seems that the key approach that's going to be important is horizontal economy-wide rules that apply to all service providers across the entire region. I think in terms of sector-specific frameworks, we need to reduce our reliance on those insofar as possible. So the future framework must include consumer law and data protection, and I think these elements are well known. A regulation of market power, obligations on gateway platforms, in particular those that are essential facilities, and enabling competition law to be used proactively. I know there was a discussion on competition law yesterday. Obligations as regards harmful content, and we need new rules on artificial intelligence, and there will be other innovations required. So we are going to need to move to regional centres of excellence and regulators where we can concentrate expertise for the entire region. And then we're going to need to fund these. And there's two models, and I would argue that the model under the GDPR in Europe, where the regulators are funded by general taxation, is the wrong model. And there are other examples. For example, there's a new digital regulator being established in Ireland, and they're going to impose a levy on the industry, on all service providers. That would strike me as the better way for this region to move forward. And next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude with two thoughts. firstly, it's going to take time to develop a regional framework, but we don't have time. We can't wait for years. That talk by Gilbert Morris, Professor Morris, was, I think, 6 or 7 years ago at Canto. It's now quite pressing. We can't wait this amount of time. So we need to take interim steps while we're building a framework that for the region that will last in the longer term. And there's some steps that we could take now. We can look at innovations like amending existing ICT laws or other local laws, so that regulators can get information from digital platforms as to what they're doing. And this will inform our decision making as well. We can apply the competition law provisions that we currently have, either in competition frameworks or in sector-specific legislation. And we can, if necessary, amend these to ensure they apply across all sectors, certainly all service providers in the digital sector. And it would also help if these could be enforced directly by individuals privately before the courts, because this will bring a form of market discipline that we're lacking at the moment. And then, an innovation that's come that I mentioned in Australia is obliging tech platforms to engage locally with service providers they rely on. So in Australia, they are obliged to engage with local media to pay them for their content. The EU now is looking at introducing a similar framework to oblige them to engage in terms of payment for infrastructure that they use and funding of future networks. So the second point then I would make in terms of including is, even when we do have a regional framework, it's still going to be difficult. So we need to be innovative here as well. For example, as I said, big tech already applies EU standards and follows EU laws in the French West Indies. So can we get them to voluntarily commit to do the same across the Caribbean region? Can we look at co-regulation type instruments that will deliver that outcome before or even while we have a new framework in place? Can we oblige them to follow child protection principles that they follow elsewhere? And there's a global movement led by the Five Rights Foundation to do just that in Africa, Latin America, I believe California as well. Can we get a commitment to that children will be protected? And then can we develop systems that enable Caribbean regulators and courts to use evidence and findings, that are coming out and will be coming out of jurisdictions such as the EU directly for similar investigations here, copycat investigations. So can we think innovatively about new partnerships, new forms of partnership? It's not just about funding for capacity building, which is important, but a deeper sort of engagement where we can benefit directly from work that's being done in jurisdictions with more resources. So I think that's the next slide, please. So I think I'll leave it there. I have some reference points on that slide, but looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much, David. And we will make the presentations available on our site, at the CTU website. So thank you. I have a question, but I'm going to leave it to the end in the interest of time, because I wanted to ask about ECTEL and whether that was a useful model for us to build on, of course, applicable to the Eastern Caribbean states, but whether or not there were some good, and I see my friend Apollo here might be able to speak to that as well later on. But I'm going to move over to Kay Seeley, Director of Trade, and of course, David presented primarily from a telecommunications perspective, or ICT perspective, I should say. But there are broader issues, of course, with respect to trade and the need for harmonization of regulations to promote digital trade and to develop digital economies, as was evident in Sophie's presentation. So why is harmonization and regulation important for us here for regional integration?
And good morning, everyone. I also wear another hat, so I'm actually the Commonwealth Cluster Lead on Regulatory Connectivity. So as it relates to harmonization, imagine it, extend your rationale at the national level to the regional level. And it is as simple as that. At the regional level, we need to ensure that there's proper functioning and implementation of whatever arrangement we're in. Now, there's CARICOM, there's the OECS, there's the Association of Caribbean States, there's CARIFORUM, which brings together CARICOM and the Dominican Republic. We have the EPA, which brings us together with the EU territories in the region. So there are numerous integration movements here in CARICOM. And by the way, does anyone know how many years CARICOM is celebrating this year? It's a big year for us. Nobody from the institutions can answer. 50. Thank you very much. Now, we harmonize because we're looking at trade in goods, services, movement of people, movement of capital. We're looking at coordination of policy. So we have CTU here. There was just mention of centers of excellence. We have CCC here. CrossQ was here this morning. OTN is here. And there's a reason why we have all these institutions. They are centers of excellence, of course, and we need them because we don't all have the capacity. We need to make sure we're all speaking from the same sheet. You know, we have a number of similarities, but there are a number of differences as well. So the extent to which we can harmonize to make it more predictable, more transparent, efficient, and of course, we're building trust. You can imagine what it is for a business person to be here in Barbados trying to figure out what is the system in Trinidad and Tobago, what's the system in Jamaica. You know, we need to be able to say with a certain amount of certainty, okay, we're all part of a particular movement. This is what obtains in Barbados. This is what obtains outside. Now, the EU might be a little different. I know the EU has a minimum harmonization type arrangement whereby they prescribe a minimum, and that is your floor in essence. You could go above. So we're trying to create a similar environment in the Caribbean whereby you know with certainty, once that is there, that is what maintains. So in a nutshell, that is why we need to harmonize. We need predictability, and in the Caribbean, we're not doing it for the governments. It's something we keep on knocking to our stakeholders. We create these arrangements for businesses, for people, you know, especially our children and for generations to come. So that is my introduction to you.
Thank you very much, Kay. And Chantal, from where you sit, of course, you're in a similar capacity, but your mandate goes beyond promoting intra-CARICOM trade, but more as well, including how we can trade with the rest of the world. So what are some of the challenges that you encounter, and can you share your perspective on this issue of harmonization?
Okay, thank you. And let me just thank the Commonwealth Secretariat and the CTU for inviting the Secretariat to share perspectives on this issue. I want to just take a step back and return to the CARICOM single market and economy initiative, of which even pursuit of a common external trade policy forms a part. And I wanted to just recall that dating back to 2017, the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM, the highest decision-making body in CARICOM, had actually approved a vision and a roadmap for creating a single CARICOM ICT space. Rodney would have mentioned this in his opening remarks. And the concept of a single ICT space is consistent with the creation of a single market, but a single market operating in a digital environment. And so the vision is really an ICT-enabled borderless space. Now, you can imagine if that's the vision, a key characteristic of a key characteristic of a single CARICOM ICT space would be a unified or harmonized or at least common regulatory framework. And so an important characteristic of this ICT space is regionally harmonized ICT policies, legislation, and also regulatory regimes. Now, I was really interested in our previous speaker speaking to the possibility of amendment, because sometimes that's what's required to achieve harmonization, not necessarily waiting on the introduction of legislation de novo, but just amending existing legislation, amending existing frameworks. And that's contemplated as part of the harmonization project as well. As Kay would have mentioned, harmonization is imperative because it's critical for easing the cost of doing business within the region. And I don't know if I could do it now or maybe a bit later, but just to flag, and it dovetails with our earlier presentation on the HIPCAR project, harmonization of this regulatory framework cuts across quite a number of issues. Data protection, intellectual property regimes, e-commerce, bearing in mind that we have had a long-standing commitment within the community to develop a protocol on electronic commerce. And I can see that there would have been earlier discussion of competition policy, as well as telecoms regulation. But I also just wanted to recall that in the revised treaty that governs and underpins the single market arrangement, harmonization of laws and administrative practices is actually contemplated generally as something that needs to support the establishment of a single market. And I just want to round off by recalling, and I think Sophie would have mentioned this as well, that there has been recognition that the imperative of recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, it really provides us with a unique opportunity to fast track digital transformation. That has been recognized at the highest level. It was recognized in the CARICOM Commission on the Economy report dating back to 2020 in the throes of the pandemic, that we had to move towards a digital economy as with alacrity. It's also been recognized by the region's trade ministers in February of last year. They approved plans and priorities for the next couple of years up to 2024. It's not too far away, 2024 is next year. Which includes a digital transformation fast tracking plan. And again, I just want to stress that it is recognized that achieving compatibility, achieving coherence, achieving harmonization of the underlying regulatory and legislative framework is seen as important. Just to round off, Rodney, you specifically asked me about the external front. I just want to underscore something that Sophie said, which is that what we're trying to do at the intra-regional level, of course, has to coexist with developments that are taking place globally. These developments relate to increasingly addressing issues relating to digital trade, for instance, in preferential trade agreements. Kay would have mentioned the CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement, which in a limited way touches on electronic commerce, but modern and deep trade agreements are going significantly further in addressing issues pertaining to digital trade. And even at the multilateral level, all CARICOM members except the Bahamas and Montserrat are members of the WTO. There are discussions taking place multilaterally on electronic commerce, and even a subset of WTO members, I think 87 if I last kept track, are actually seeking to go further in a plurilateral initiative to establish what they're calling high level or high ambition rules to address trade related aspects of e-commerce. So just situating the need for these efforts at harmonization to take stock of not just what countries may want to achieve at the national level, what goals they set at the regional level, but also what's taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So I think we are unanimous in our view that harmonization is very important. Yeah. So the challenges though with that, I mean, I referenced the institutions and the funding, for example, and it for me is a measure of the commitment of the region to harmonization with respect to the commitment to the institutions that it has established to drive this harmonization. And I can point to, I mean, like for example, the single ICT space, the roadmap, and we can look at funding for that. Where's the funding to actually make it happen? Sophie, you worked with the HIPCAR project. What are some of the how successful was it really? And what are some of the challenges with respect to trying to whether they're the lack of political will or the silos when you come to the sovereign states and the turf wars that we have even within this small space? Speaking very frankly, what are some of the challenges that we have?
I'm looking at my colleague Cleveland. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about the various harmonization projects that we did, right? So not just to point a finger at the Caribbean, I also have the experience of doing the UEMOA, ECOWAS, COMESA, also harmonization projects in South Saharan Africa. There are always challenges because you always have issues of national sovereignty. You have issues of administrative capacities. You have administrative history. I mean, if I think of the project we did in Western Africa, where we tried to bring together the Anglophone with the Francophone and the Lusophone countries, you had very different legal traditions there. So how do you find the common denominator to harmonize? And having started my career in the European Commission, working on the OMP directive, the mobile green paper, the satellite green paper, the audiovisual green paper, and the whole series of harmonization and liberalization that took place in Europe. So I think one point I want to make is when you're looking at harmonization, when you're looking at these projects, really do start with an assessment. Really analyze the data points. Where are the gaps? What needs to be fixed? And again, that comes to the point that David made and that Chantal made as well. You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you have basic texts that are already in place and that just need to be adapted. So start with that assessment. And I think that was one of the core success factors of HIPCAR, is that we started with that assessment. I think the second point is get all the stakeholders around the table. Now, one of the key success factors of the UEMOA and of HIPCAR as well is that we didn't just bring in the telecoms regulators. We brought a whole series of stakeholders. It's not just about capacity building, it's about listening. And again, that comes to that data, right? It's about listening. It's about understanding the concerns. I look at David. We've had a lot of discussions between OTTs versus incumbents, right, David? Including in the Bahamas, right, David? So bring in all the different aspects to understand the concerns, understand the economic concerns. It's about the bottom line. And as you said, it's about, I think at the end of the day, it's about the people. Let's keep in mind that it's about the people. And also, again, it comes to funding. These projects take a lot of work and a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to take it further, to not just have a consultant come in for 3 weeks and then have all the paper put in the drawers and forgotten about. So you really need that sustainability. You need these sustainable efforts to come to that harmonization. And for that, again, I come to bring all the stakeholders around the table, because when you're talking about these regional harmonization initiatives, bring in your trade people, bring in your regional organization people, have those discussions with them, and digital cuts across the sectors. I'm really pleased to see that the Attorney General opened these sessions. Bring in the judiciary, because they need to implement these texts. They need to understand them. So it's really about being comprehensive. It's really about being data-oriented, so evidence-oriented, and it's really about being inclusive. Those are just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. David, I asked the initial question about ECTEL. Is ECTEL the shining example for us here in the region? We understand there's a closer political union even within the OECS, and they have more harmonized structures. The Eastern Caribbean Telecoms Authority I'm referring to. What are your thoughts on that as a model, and how has that worked?
Thank you. Broadly, well, I'll first declare I'm a St. Lucian citizen myself. So Anyway, I've worked as well as having a close affinity to ECTEL and St. Lucia. We've worked together, of course, on very many projects over the years. I suppose, at a high level, yes. It is the OECS in particular is an ECTEL in the field of telecoms. They are the shining examples of success in terms of a degree of harmonization on various themes in the region. A couple of thoughts on that. Firstly, often harmonization is compared to the European example. There was a huge driver for integration and harmonization in Europe post 1945, because and it was because of the disaster that we managed to visit on ourselves in Europe, that there was the political objection to integration was removed, and everyone recognized that we need to do something in a new way. I think that's often missing, that component, thankfully, because you hopefully don't have to go to that place to decide cooperation is better. But that element is often missing around the world at other regional efforts at integration. There has been a success in the Caribbean, in as you said, in the OCS and ECTEL. But I think if you look then at some of the more recent examples, I think we have to question whether we could do it better. And like the EC, or the Electronic Communications Act in the ECTEL region, which was the reform of the Telecoms Act that was introduced in 2000. So in around 2010, it was decided to update this legislation. That has taken years. It still isn't enacted in all the ECTEL states, as 2023. So there's a process question there. Why not? So that's coming back to my point about what happened in Europe, but that's often about drive and structure. How do you make this integration happen? How do you have a process that makes it go forward? In Europe, they develop those processes. So do we need to look at that? And the second point I'd make about that EC Act, if I may, is, and I think, I think everybody in the process is well aware of the difficulties we had. But one of the problems was that, it was it wasn't as future looking as it might have been for various reasons. And coming back to Gilbert Morris's point about, how policy is shaped in the region, it didn't really look to, what is the economy going to look like in 10 or 15 years' time. It was more about fixing legislation that already existed. So that probably was the wrong approach. And the second point was that a lot of the discussion was informed by consultants who were coming in internationally with their experience of what worked in Europe and what worked in other places. But this was wholly inappropriate for the Caribbean. It wasn't realistic to expect that solutions that worked at the European Commission or with its network of regulators in Europe of whatever it is, probably 10,000 people, staff, what they can do there or what we can do in the Caribbean are vastly different. So it wasn't, coming back to the point I made earlier, I think we need to look at norms that we think are good and say, okay, we'd like to follow them, but we have to make them digestible in our region. I think that was part of the problem as to why it took so long for the legislation to pass, because there really wasn't that level of cohesiveness as to what we're trying to do. So there's lessons, I think, from ECTEL that are very valuable.
Thank you, David. I want to open for questions, but just before we do that, I'll just pass back over to Kay and Chantal. With respect to the focus on harmonization within the region, a lot of, well, it's certainly in the case of data protection legislation, a lot of it was driven by the GDPR, the EU's move to implement the general data protection regulations. To what extent are these external factors more, I guess, more of a driving force than our own regional imperatives, right? The markets outside are much bigger. Are government's really that concerned so much about intra-CARICOM trade as opposed to trading with external partners? And is that sort of the motivation or a demotivation for driving harmonization regionally?
If I can probably take a stab at it, just to say that as you're getting to the point, regional integration is not static. So you may find in some movements you may be reactive as opposed to proactive. There are real capacity constraints, and as you would in the real world, yes, it would be wonderful if you can be 10 steps ahead, and we could put all these things in place in a timely manner to make us blend in, and integrate into the world economy a lot easier than it probably is right now. But I find sometimes, yes, external forces drive a lot of the changes in CARICOM, and honestly, COVID has been, I don't want to say it's a blessing, but never lose, as the Prime Minister Barbados says, never lose a good crisis to make the necessary changes that you need to put in place. So yes, regional integration is there to create the best terms and conditions and benefits for your own market. So you would love to maximize the level of intra-regional trade, of course, but you're mindful that you can't just trade within yourself. You need to trade externally as well. In the EU, I think intra-regional trade accounts for about 70% of all trade, all goods produced in the EU, close to about 70% consumed within the EU. That is not the case in CARICOM. I think last check, probably less than 20%, and we need to up those numbers. So even though you need to strike the balance, each one is important. You build on your synergies within CARICOM, build on your capacities. That is supposed to be your easiest market, should be your easiest market to penetrate. But we have high levels of imports from outside. You need foreign currency, US currency, EU currencies, but it is driven from inside and outside. And we cannot ignore the external forces, the external developments, and we need to react as quickly as possible. In a nutshell, if we can preempt them, not preempt, but predict and do what we need to do beforehand, that would be wonderful. But we're small, and even within our states, we all have different levels of size and development. So we need to moderate expectations.
Thank you. Chantal?
Really agree with everything that Kay said, and it goes back to the point that I made that even when you are seeking to fashion an initiative intra-regionally, you can't be ignorant of global developments. The global developments may pertain to an important trading partner like the EU or the US, but as I mentioned before, there are global developments that may not be unique to one trading partner, in which we may not be participating, but which will set the standards according to which we have to meet as well. But I just wanted to register a point about trying to achieve coherence or harmonization. I think that the chances of doing so are significantly higher if what you are trying to fashion at the regional level is consistent with national priorities. If the two are at odds, you're just not going to have the attention, or you're not going to have the traction with the initiatives. And this is why digital transformation is different than I think some other attempts at fashioning harmonization, because it is a national priority for many of us. Many of us recognize that supplying services or trading over digital networks allows us to transcend constraints of small size. It allows us to achieve economies of scale that we might otherwise not be able to achieve. That is something that unifies all of us, even the larger ones, because it's all relative. So I think that this is an important space where we have to be very strategic in what we set as our targets at the regional level, and we should be aiming at the regional level to fashion initiatives that are consistent with national priorities. I just also wanted to quickly underscore the importance of consultations to this process. Regional initiatives are fashioned on the basis of national positions being developed. Those national positions are robust if they're underpinned by wide-ranging consultations. Sometimes the strength of what you're able to fashion at the regional level is a function of how strong or weak the national consultative process is. And so sometimes if there is sign off on something at the regional level for which there has not been buy-in secured at the national level, you can have on paper agreement by a community organ to something, but the rubber is going to hit the road when it comes to implementation. So I really just want to underscore that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I won't push that any further, but certainly even on the issue of single ICT space, and really the question was whether once a decision is made by the CARICOM heads when they meet, can we take it for granted that that national consultation has taken place? Everybody knows we're on the same page, we're ready to run.
Right, so the quick response, Rodney, is no, and so improving that consultative process is a high agenda issue for the region. It's actually a responsibility of one of our most senior organs, the Community Council, consistently looking at the system of consultations and seeing how it can be improved. And just to recall, the governance framework that we have in CARICOM, the governance framework which is agreed, is one where decisions do not become automatically implemented just because they're taken. Our governance framework is one which is dependent on member states taking actions at the national level to implement the decisions. And when you're talking about legislative changes, you're contending also with what's high on the legislative priorities of the individual member state, which is why I'm reiterating the importance of efforts at harmonization at the regional level being successful when they happen to coincide with what is a priority at the national level as well.
Thank you for that. Vashti, do we have any questions online? Do we have any questions in the room?
Yes, please, Chair. We do have a question online. Before we go out to the room, I see some hands raised. We have a question from Dorecia Wilkinson, and this question is for the panel itself. Multiple people here, rightly so, highlighted the need for harmonization. Are there steps in place to actively work towards this? I'm just curious if the wheel is already rolling on this to get a sense of how far away from achieving this is it possible as a region. Thank you.
So, sounds like it was kind of directed at me too. We're not where we need to be, and I just want to, in terms of actually realizing harmonization, but I do want to stress this. One, going back to something Sophie said, it's a bit behind schedule, but importantly, a gap analysis is high on the agenda with respect to the advancing the single ICT space. That is something that has been commissioned. Secondly, I want to just speak a little bit to the framework that we have in place in the region to facilitate efforts at harmonization. As I said, we do have ministerial organs that take policy decisions. So whether it's a ministerial council like the one responsible for trade and economic development, or it's the finance ministers, which in this space may have remit over some of the issues as well, they can approve the regional policy. But we have a legal affairs committee on which ministers with responsibility for legal affairs or attorney generals sit, and that's actually the body which is charged under the treaty with facilitating harmonization, for instance, by approving model legislation. But again, I want to stress that there are multiple ways to achieve. Sometimes I am reticent to use the term harmonization because it makes people think that everything has to be identical, but at least convergence or compatibility or coherence. There are various tools that can be used to do that, which don't necessarily, as I said, require everyone to adopt de novo legislation on a particular issue. But if there are sufficient commonalities in the regulatory framework, it can facilitate cross-border transactions with greater ease. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Kay.
Just to add on a practical point, there are some digital platforms which already are in place in CARICOM. There is SIMSUPRO, which is the CARICOM Integrated Marketplace and Suspension Procedure. There are also public procurement portals, which every single member state in CARICOM is supposed to have. There's also the CARICOM Single Market Application Processing System. So there are some steps which have been taken to put the region in a good place as it relates to digital platforms which can help to promote trade and investment. So things are happening in different places in CARICOM, but they all redound to the big picture to get a digital economy in place.
Thank you.
Rodney?
Should we open to the room?
Rodney, could I? Sorry.
I see if I can just start with Chris and go around the room. Thank you.
Hi there, Chris Southworth from the International Chamber of Commerce. Just a question for Chantal. I mean, from a digital trade perspective, I don't think the EU is leading at all. They're no further ahead than the Caribbean, actually, in terms of modern trade agreements. There are two trade agreements, actually, that come within this network, which is really interesting, I think, that could be applied in the Caribbean, actually could be applied worldwide, from my perspective. There's the deeper agreement in the East between Singapore, Chile, New Zealand. It's not the best agreement in the world, but the modularity of it is interesting, and whether you could do that, and you can allow countries to bolt in and allow to get started. I'm interested in your views on that. And then the gold standard now for me is the UK-Singapore DEA, Digital Economy Agreement, because it allows for a lot of flexibility. It's underpinned by MOUs. It ticks all the boxes that we've been discussing over the last sort of 24 hours. And most importantly, in terms of from a commercial point of view, it's all about alignment and interoperability. And I just wonder whether you think there's scope there, a sort of somehow maybe a modular DEA style agreement across the region could be interesting as a way forward.
Yes, very interesting question. And I'm going to answer you by returning to the commitment that I referenced before. It's not specifically about the digital economy, but it's related. There is, as I said, long-standing commitment in the revised treaty to conclude protocol on e-commerce. Of course, the region isn't locked into only addressing the subject of e-commerce. The region could use the opportunity of addressing that issue and its ambition of achieving a single ICT space to go broader and address digital economy issues if it wishes. And I do think that these digital economy partnership agreements are useful models or references. Actually, my view is that in fashioning intra-regional rules, we should always be cognizant of international best practice, not to copy and paste it, but just to be able to understand if there are elements that would work well in our space. As a matter of fact, more broadly speaking, with respect to the pursuit of our external trade policy, we're reckoning with the reality of declining trade performance generally. And we have to assess what kind of strategies we want to pursue to improve the region's external trade performance and trade performance generally. And there's no getting around the fact that to improve your trade performance in the current environment, that partly has to involve how you adapt to digital technologies, how you integrate digital technologies, and how you adapt to a rapidly changing technological change, how you adapt to rapid technological changes. And I think as part of that assessment of how we improve our external trade performance or trade performance generally, we're going to have to think about whether the traditional trade agreement, which is just focused on liberalizing tariffs, is really the way for us to go, or whether we need to be looking at different forms of cooperation, which may be not just about securing market access, but it may be about supply chain resilience, it may be about digital economy related issues. And that's why I think looking at these models is something, we're already doing it, and it's something that I think we need to do more of.
Thank you. Next question, in the interest of time. Yes. Over here, red dress. Sorry, can you say your name, please?
Sorry, Finidi Williams, CARICAD intern.
Okay.
Okay, so given the disparity with respect to the varying levels of development coming out of the member islands, how then will harmonization be achieved, and what does the success of harmonization look like with respect to that?
That's a very good question, and one of the points I was making was that of moderation of expectations. And as Sophie said, you need to know where each member state is coming from. So until you have that assessment done, that would inform where you can pitch your level of ambition. In the Caribbean, as it relates to decision making, there are two different types in essence. There's one where you're looking at the lowest common denominator, and there's one where you're looking at the highest, the goal. And it's where you can pitch your expectations along that spectrum. Now, the discussion we had this morning about small businesses, I asked about micro and how you convince. You need to be able to convince member states that this is good for you. This will benefit you. And unless you can show from the get-go that this will impact you in a positive manner, it is very, very challenging to achieve harmonization at a level which will really redound to the benefit of all participants. So decision-making, where you position yourself, having that appropriate assessment done at the beginning, and also you need to factor in the whole issue of regulatory impact assessments. So from the get-go, you need to be able to show in 2 years' time, in 6 months' time, this is what we're going to do to assess whether or not this is working. So these are the things that we need to do to convince member states to move in certain directions in order to achieve harmonization.
And Sophie, quickly as well.
And
then we'll take the other
that impact assessment, I think what's important as well is you need to show, because at the end of the day, you need champions to enable the harmonization, because you need the adoption, the implementation, and the enforcement. And I think to win those champions, you need the numbers. You need to look at the economic impact of these decisions. And that information is out there. In ITU, we've done a series of regional studies of the economic impact of broadband digitalization and ICT regulation. This harmonization has an impact, and that, again, your politicians need to know that.
Thank you. Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the panel discussion and for allowing me. Just in the interest of time, practically for us in the region, I would like to propose, I think that us within the region, may it be the law reform commissions, may it be the CPC departments, I think the conversation can happen between ourselves, among ourselves. I think that all that was proposed to us is sound and correct, but we can have discussions among each other. So take, for instance, when we were doing decriminalization of marijuana in Trinidad and Tobago, what we did with our Law Reform Commission, together with our CPC department, is start building a matrix of what everyone's legislation looked like. And we went throughout the Caribbean, and we went throughout CARICOM. And then we started calling each other. Our former Attorney General Faris Alwari was on the phone with Guyana, on the phone with St. Vincent, on the phone with, and we were building out our policy and legislation together by just conversing. I also think that human capacity and resources are needed, because the last time I was here, I think the Honorable Attorney General of St. Vincent was here under the RSS at a different time. And we were speaking about, I can't remember, I think it was something in corruption. And Dominica said to me, the representative there, we don't have our legislation online. And I said, what? That was very strange to me. And it was because of human capacity, lack of it, and resources. And I think that if we're able to build that in each country, that's where we need the political willpower. But then when we also have the conversation between ourselves as to what is happening in your country, what is the political will there, what does your policy look like? And of course, policy informs the legislation, then we're going to be on the same page with each other. So I think practically for us as professionals, technocrats, I think that conversation, together with all that CARICOM shares, I think also a good example is what I raised yesterday with Chris, where CARICOM is on the same page with this UN Convention on Cybercrime, we'll call it that for now, because we're all talking to each other, our 14 member states. I did my homework last night, and I sent in my comments, right? So that goes off to the other member states, and then they're going to add theirs. So we're going to have one voice on the table, and that, I think that will help us a lot right here in these types of sessions. Thank you.
So that's an excellent summary. We don't have time, unfortunately, for closing remarks. So that was an excellent summation. And I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you, David, Sophie, Kay, and Chantal for your contribution today. We've taken copious notes, and I look forward to coming up with some steps for the way forward. Thank you as well for your attention. Vashti, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Give a round of applause to the panel. I know I'm that person who's standing between you and lunch right now. Francola, do you have any housekeeping announcements to make?
Thank you, David. I'll be in touch.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. So yes, the